been quite this tall before. So the very first thing I want to do is to thank everyone here. I feel like I was really brought here by Hashem, by God, to receive a message that perhaps isn't the message I would be hearing in some of the religious spaces that I inhabit. So I feel like God is moving through his congregation, and even though I'm from an Orthodox Jewish background, I feel like there's a beauty and a wisdom here that is very palpable and very intense and emotional. I also want to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who have enduring sovereignty of the land, sky, sea and community, and to this community as well. Someone had said earlier about sitting on the sidelines and trying to be safe. Engaging with other religions isn't safe, and it isn't easy, and it isn't necessarily universally approved of within my religious community, but luckily I've got a religious legal authority that I've used who said, absolutely fine, go ahead, go, this is important. That's the message I got. Now, hatred is both an ancient story and a new one. It's reinvented in every time and place. The book of Shmuel, or Samuel, tells the story of King Shaul, or King Saul, and his hatred for David, King David, his son-in-law and rival for the throne. We learn about Shaul's humble beginnings as the son of Kish from the tribe of Binyamin in 1 Shmuel chapter 9. We're told that Kish had a son whose name was Shaul. He was young and goodly. There was no one else in the children of Israel and the whole people who was a goodlier person than he was. This Shaul is a man whose youthful holiness earns him God's favor. And on this basis, the prophet Shmuel, Samuel, is divinely inspired to appoint Shaul as the first king over a united biblical nation of Israel. The story of Shaul's kingship also appears in the Quran, where he is known as Talut. And in Surat al-Baqarah, in chapter 2, verses 246 to 50, it's described Talut's ascendancy to this kingdom of Israel. And in fact, when I was looking for sources about Shaul, I found that some Muslim teachings view this particular surah about Talut, or Shaul, as a lesson to choose leaders based on their holiness, not on their political connections or their status. So Shaul is a model of a great leader at this point in time, and yet later we encounter a very different Shaul, a Shaul who is brimming with murderous hatred. What is it that invokes this hatred? In Jewish exegesis, we have a saying, Shivim panim la Torah. There are 70 faces to the Torah. And psychological research shows us that people are also multidimensional, often acting out of a variety of motivations rather than a single one. Yet one face of Shaul's hatred seems particularly clear. In Shmuel Aleph, that is 1 Samuel, we learn about the bond between Yonatan, or Jonathan, Shaul's oldest son, and David, the youngest son of Yishai, Bet Halachmi, who was from Bethlehem. And we know that after Shaul had spoken with David, the soul of Yonatan became linked with the soul of David. And it says that Yonatan loved him kenafsho, as if, like his own soul, he loved him that much, he was so much a part of him. And they made a covenant together, as many of you are probably familiar with these verses. And we also have further elaboration when David is mourning the death of Jonathan in Shmuel Bet, in chapter 1, verse 26, when he says, I'm so distressed that your love was wonderful to me, surpassing the love of women. And of course David had quite a few wives, so we know that that love must have been quite abundant. Now, David's threat to Shaul's kingship may have been one motivation for why Shaul attempts to murder David, and certainly that is one of the dominant interpretations in my own religion. However, Shaul also reveals a different motivation that is clearly related to his hostile reaction to the relationship between his son Yonatan and David. Shaul says this in a fit of anger, after Yonatan has attempted to protect David from Shaul's violent schemes. So in Shmuel Aleph 20:30, we find out that Shaul's anger was enraged against Yehonatan, and he says to his son, "You, son of perverse rebellion, I don't know. Do I not know that you have chosen the son of Ishai, that is David, to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness?" Now this kind of language is very specifically code, or very pretty obvious to talk about some sort of romantic or sexual type of implication. So although the dominant interpretation in Orthodox Judaism is not this one, that is one of the 70 faces. And this really speaks to me. Following this diatribe, Shaul reiterates his desire to murder David. This biblical example of apparent homophobic hatred in a man whose holiness earned him the first kingship of the people does seem quite puzzling. Which is the real Shaul? The murderous Shaul, or the young lad filled with goodness? But the book of Shmuel, like many books of the Torah, documents both Shaul's holiness and his profanity. It documents his Yetzer Tov, his good inclination, and his Yetzer Hara, his evil inclination. These inclinations that each of us has within us. Now, hatred has a new face in every time and place, yet it is as old as the biblical Shaul, hurling his spear at David and accusing his son Yehonatan of shaming him through his love for David. In December 1989, a 24-year-old man, also named David McMahon, was ambushed and beaten by a group of people who dragged him to the edge of a cliff near Bondi Beach, intending to throw him over to his death. Like the biblical David, this modern-day David escaped from this new incarnation of Shaul's hatred. Many others were not so fortunate. According to hate crimes researchers, an estimated 50 to 80 gay men and women of trans experience, some of whom have been misclassified as gay men, were beaten and thrown to their deaths from the Bondi and Tamarama cliffs between the late 1970s and the early 1990s. In 2015, we live in a world in which this hatred persists. In September 2014, Guardian Australia obtained and independently translated 6 letters from 4 gay men from Iran seeking asylum in Australia. These men were detained on Manus Island in Papua New Guinea, where same-gender expressions of physical love are classified as unnatural acts and punishable by up to 14 years in prison. They had escaped one climate of hatred, only for the Australian government to cruelly thrust them into another. Some reported being sexually assaulted or targeted for brutal treatment. Some felt that their only option was death. In an excerpt from his suicide note, a man pseudonymously known only as Omid wrote, "I wish our boat had sunk in the ocean and stopped me living the most painful year of my life. I thought Australia and its people would be my protector, but they taught me otherwise." Although Omid survived his suicide attempt, Omid is not alone in feeling such despair as a result of hatred. But not all manifestations of evil are as obvious to detect as the cruel treatment received by Omid and other asylum seekers. Jewish scholar and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel has said that the opposite of love is not hate, it is indifference. We speak about problems of phobia as if injustice were mainly about fear and hostility, when so often, in fact, injustice is about our indifference to hostility and violence. You may have heard of sister girls, one term for Aboriginal, Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander cultures, for people who are assigned as male and grow up in some cases living as women in all or part of their lives, and in some cases living in a traditional third gender, just called sister girl. And brother boys are assigned as female and grow up as men or as brother boys. There are an estimated 5 to 10% of the Tiwi Islands population who are sister girls. Today, in 2015, many sister girls, brother boys, and Aboriginal people of trans experience in the Northern Territory have been forced to leave their land, their homes, and their communities with all of their close kinship ties because there are so few medical professionals willing to provide the medical care they need anywhere that they can reach. This forced relocation is but one of many similar injustices to which the traditional custodians who retain sovereignty of country have been and continue to be subjected. Intersex is an umbrella term that describes the bodily diversity of people with a variety of chromosomal, hormonal, gonadal, and genital characteristics that are not viewed as strictly female or male in modern medical standards. Medical students are rarely taught about the history of how these medical norms and standards about intersex bodily diversity have changed over time. Today, in the Australia of 2015, female genital mutilation is a criminal act. Intersex genital mutilation is standard medical practice. Today, in 2015, New South Wales anti-discrimination legislation does not acknowledge or protect bisexual people. As the Anti-Discrimination Board of New South Wales explained in a document called The Neglected Communities in 2003, it is of course a fine line, but the Act does not currently provide recourse for bisexuals who consider that they have been subjected to discrimination because they are not homosexual. Unquote. Today, in 2015, we know that many lesbian and bisexual women are not only targeted for public violence, the same sexual violence that many women are targeted for in public spaces, but also have higher rates of breast cancer than the population average for women, and also receive less routine healthcare screening than other women. They are less likely than other women to feel safe disclosing clinical information, and even when they do, their health needs are often neglected. Heterosexism, ways of thinking and acting that assume all people are, or should be, heterosexual, can be more insidious than homophobia because what is hidden is harder to identify and therefore to change. Cisgenderism, or ways of thinking and acting that invalidate people's own understandings of their genders and their bodies, can be equally insidious because there is no hostile enemy there to identify. Yet assumptions and neglect can kill as surely as the spear that the biblical Shaul heard at David. As Elie Wiesel has said, the opposite of love is not hate, it is indifference. Hatred may be an ancient story, but love is an even older story. The great 16th century Jewish mystic and renowned Kabbalist, Rabbi Yitzhak ben Shlomo Luria Ashkenazi, the Arizal, who lived in Sfat under Ottoman Syria, explained the creation of the world as a product of Tzimtzum, a contraction God made in the supreme act of love to make space for the creation of the world. The vessels into which God placed the divine light used for creation shattered, trapping sparks of holiness in the shards. And this is a Kabbalistic belief, is central to Judaism. The concept of tikkun olam, which some of you might have heard of, popularized by the Arizal, literally means repairing the world. In an Orthodox Jewish perspective, we believe that the purpose of the 613 Torah commandments, or mitzvot, is to heal the world and liberate the sparks of holiness embedded in these metaphysical shards of brokenness. In Jewish tradition, we learn about the courage to begin this process of healing. Our insights into Torah liturgy do not come from the written Torah alone, that is what Christians might call the Hebrew Bible, but also from our integration of insights from the oral Torah that we believe was given over alongside the written Torah at Har Sinai, or Mount Sinai, and from rabbinic commentaries that have debated these insights over the centuries. The combination of this oral Torah, or Mishnah, alongside these commentaries, also known as Gemara, is what you might have heard referred to as the Talmud. In the very first book of the Mishnah, Seder Zra'im, or the Order of Seeds, the oral Torah discusses the prayer obligations of people with a tumtum or androgynous body, two Jewish legal categories for intersex characteristics. The Talmud documents generations of rabbis debating the specific prayers that a tumtum or androgynous should say. And although we could read this as a lack of understanding or as oppressive, there is a more fundamental lesson for us here. The main goal of this debate was to make space within a society that had determined that gender was based on physical characteristics, to try to build inclusive communities for people whose bodies would otherwise be excluded. This clear example of religious legal thinking being applied to develop strategies for social inclusion is an example of traditional insights that have been obscured by contemporary prejudices. At the Kriyat Yam Suf, the splitting of the Sea of Reeds, when the prince of the tribe of Yehuda, Nachshon ben Aminadav, stood at the Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds, with Pharaoh's army close behind him, none of the 12 tribes wanted to be the first to jump into the sea. Nachshon ben Aminadav of the tribe of Yehuda, was the first to leap into the sea toward freedom from enslavement in Egypt. And at the time he leapt in, the waves completely were almost swallowing him. The sea had not parted. He jumped in before they had parted. And when the prophetess Miriam led the women in song at the first prayer service following the Yetziat Mitzrayim, the escape from Egypt, she did so based on her spiritual calling from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed is God's name. And these leaders each demonstrated the actions that are needed for this tikkun olam, this repairing the world. Nachshon demonstrated the need for critical thinking and independent action to challenge the injustices of our time. Miriam displayed the community building and affirmation needed to heal from oppression and injustice. Courage and joy, action and song. Nachshon and Miriam both enacted vital elements of social change. The Hebrew word for the biblical Egypt is Mitzrayim, which comes from Metzah, meaning narrow. It literally means the narrow place. This work of Tikkun Olam requires us to walk in narrow places and to walk through them, to experience them, to allow ourselves to see the suffering of others without indifference, and to be ready to challenge oppression and to help others, even if we are the first to dive into a situation, even when it is scary. Among the 63 tractates of this Mishnah, or this oral Torah, only one focuses on moral advice rather than legislation. And this tractate, known as Pirkei Avot, or Wisdom of the Fathers, is a compilation of insights from religious scholars of multiple generations, ethics of the Fathers. In Pirkei Avot, we learn about our obligation to engage in this Tikkun Olam, or this healing the world. Rabbi Tarfon taught that it is not our responsibility to finish the work, this Tikkun Olam work, but we are not free to desist from it either. Shmirat halashon, or guarding our speech, we begin this work with a kind word of affirmation, such as when we call our friend with a non-binary gender by their preferred name and pronoun. We begin by speaking out against stereotypes when one of our friends makes a disparaging remark about bisexual people. We begin by contracting ourselves the way that God did to create the universe, this tzimtzum. We contract ourselves and the space we take up so that there is room to listen to and hear another person's pain. We begin by joining with people who have survived suffering, our voices interweaving in songs of joy that affirm the blessings of life. We begin by learning and acknowledging the sacredness and value of other people's experiences of their genders, their bodies, their relationships, and their sexualities. As Elie Wiesel has said, we must not see any person as an abstraction, a phenomenon. A phenomenon like homosexuality, bisexuality. No, we're not talking about it, we're talking about a human being. So Elie Wiesel said, we must not see any person as an abstraction. Instead, we must see in every person a universe, with its own secrets, its own treasures, with its own sources of anguish, and some measure of triumph. Tikkun Olam lies in finding that measure of triumph even in the midst of anguish, in the witnessing and honoring of another person's universe, as manifested in the everyday affirmation of a supportive word, a gentle hand on a shoulder, a smile, a nod, or even a glance. We are more than labels and abstractions. We are more than muscle, blood, and bone. Elie Wiesel has said that the opposite of faith is not heresy, it is indifference. Let us never be indifferent to the suffering of people whose experiences of their genders, relationships, bodies, or sexualities we perceive as different from our own. Let us engage in critical thinking and debate l'shem shamayim, or for the sake of heaven, and never use faith as a mask for bigotry or oppression. Let us work to challenge our respective faiths, and by transforming the force of religion into healing through courage and joy and action and song. Let us honor the neshama, the soul, within ourselves and within each person we meet during this process of Tikkun Olam, of healing the world and our communities. I am so grateful for this blessing of sharing this day with you. Thank you so much.